Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking the anatomy of isolation. Specifically, we're looking at what actually happens to the human brain in solitary confinement. We're going to go on a bit of a journey today, starting way down deep inside the microbiology of the brain, and then zooming all the way out to the macro level of global prison systems. It's an absolutely fascinating look at how deeply our environments literally shape our minds, and I am so excited to explore the science and the data behind all this with you.
Now, right off the bat, we have to recognize that there is a massive difference between peaceful solitude and forced isolation, right? We all know that choosing to be alone, taking a break from the noise, has well-documented stress-relieving benefits. But when isolation is involuntarily forced on you, and indefinitely, well, it completely stops being a break. Instead, it becomes this profound threat to your core sense of identity. And the data shows us that the longer a person is isolated, the more severe and the more persistent these psychological effects become.
So why does this happen? Well, it brings us to a really crucial psychological concept called social reality testing. Think about it like this. Social interactions and just doing meaningful activities every day are absolutely essential for our emotional stability, mostly because they act as our internal sounding board. They allow us to constantly gauge how rational our perceptions of the world actually are. So imagine suddenly losing that sounding board. When someone is entirely deprived of communication and productive tasks, their very sense of reality is threatened. Without that constant reality check, thoughts can spiral out of control really fast. Impulses just take the reins, and that sets the stage for deep depression, obsessive thoughts, suicidal ideation, and even full-blown delusions or hallucinations.
And when that sounding board vanishes, it sets off a very specific, honestly terrifying neurological chain reaction in the brain. Early on in forced isolation, step 1 kicks in. Stress hormones just spike. Then, as days turn into weeks or even months, that stress becomes chronic. That leads us to step 2, where the brain's limbic system, which is the area that regulates fear and stress, becomes incredibly hyperactive because of all that prolonged agitation. And finally, step 3, the prefrontal cortex, the brain's central hub for reasoning and moral judgment. Well, it can actually physically shrink. This seriously impairs focus, memory, and cognition. Basically, the brain's entire balance literally shifts away from rational thinking, swinging heavily towards extreme emotionality and fear.
But, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, this isn't just a temporary bad mood. The biggest takeaway here is that this imbalance becomes ingrained. As a person sits in the state of indefinite isolation, the actual physical architecture of their brain changes. This brand new, fear-dominant neurological balance becomes deeply, deeply set. And that paves the way for individuals to become incredibly prone to severe bouts of anxiety, totally unpredictable rage, and deeply irrational actions.
Okay, so if we zoom out from the brain to the rest of the body, we see what is essentially a cascading physical collapse. Isolated individuals very often lose their fundamental sense of time. They suffer from severe sleep difficulties, heart palpitations, chronic headaches, intense dizziness, and extreme hypersensitivity. And thanks to stress-induced digestive issues and a completely ruined appetite, severe weight loss is also extremely common. Now, you might be wondering, couldn't someone just try to cope by establishing a healthy routine? Maybe reading or doing robust exercise in their cell? Well, unfortunately, the data shows that these coping mechanisms simply cannot fix or override the massive physical toll that isolation takes on the body.
Because of these extensive and truly severe neurological and physical effects, international bodies, including the United Nations and numerous human rights organizations, actually classify this kind of forced, prolonged isolation as torture. Now, in the context of the justice system, you'll often hear this practice called solitary confinement or restrictive housing. But structurally and functionally, based purely on the objective metrics of these global organizations, it falls squarely under the category of torture.
Yet, despite that international classification, the societal scale of this practice is just staggering. 120,000. In the year 2019, more than 120,000 prisoners in the United States alone were living in solitary confinement. To put that into perspective, that is over 100,000 human beings spending 22 to 24 hours every single day inside mostly windowless cells that are roughly 6 by 9 feet. Just try to picture being confined to a space that small for almost your entire day.
So how exactly did this become so common? Well, it actually started way back in the late 1700s when Quaker groups introduced solitary confinement as a more humane alternative to corporal punishment. Their original idea was that isolation would bring about quiet reflection and penitence, which, fun fact, is actually where we get the word penitentiary. But by the 1800s, its use seriously dwindled because it started facing massive, high-level criticism. Fast forward, though, to the 1980s. Alongside new, tough-on-crime laws, U.S. prison populations totally skyrocketed.
And as these facilities grew incredibly crowded, protests and violence naturally increased right along with them. In response to that, authorities increasingly used solitary confinement simply as a primary tool to maintain control of these overcrowded populations.
And because it became this everyday tool for control, the threshold for who gets isolated shifted completely. Systemic overcrowding meant that a lot of people were getting placed in solitary for entirely minor, non-violent infractions. We're talking about things as small as just talking back to a prison guard. And what makes this even more complex is that while solitary is harmful to literally everyone, many of the individuals experiencing it already have pre-existing mental health disorders. And this extreme environment rapidly and severely exacerbates those conditions.
You know what's fascinating, though? The backlash against this practice isn't just a modern phenomenon. Not at all. When the famous author Charles Dickens witnessed the early iterations of this system, he firmly condemned solitary confinement, calling it, quote, worse than any torture of the body. So, high-level criticism regarding the immense psychological toll of isolation has existed almost exactly as long as the practice itself.
To really understand why observers like Dickens were so deeply disturbed by this, we have to look at the aftermath. The data leaves us with a pretty staggering multiplier. 3. Individuals who go through solitary confinement are 3 times more likely to show signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember those ingrained brain imbalances we talked about earlier? Yeah, those don't just magically reset the moment the cell door opens.
Let's break down what that lasting aftermath actually looks like in everyday life. People who have experienced this report major, enduring shifts in their personalities. They experience heavily increased anxiety and paranoia in completely ordinary situations, and they struggle immensely with just concentrating or connecting with other people. Readjusting to life outside that 6x9 cell becomes incredibly difficult. Now, it's worth noting that some states have tried to restrict its use for certain groups, or they've adopted 15 to 20-day limits. But unfortunately, these regulations aren't always enforced, and authorities have found plenty of loopholes. Ultimately, this lasting neurological and psychological damage actively works against the overarching goal of rehabilitation, all while failing to reduce overall prison violence.
This brings us to a really fascinating structural comparison between the United States system and Norway's model. While the U.S. approach has historically leaned heavily into a punitive model utilizing solitary confinement, Norway imprisons far fewer people and takes a completely different path. They actually spend about 5 times more money per prisoner, focusing heavily on better accommodations, educational classes, and work release programs. And when we look at the data completely objectively, the outcomes really do speak for themselves. Norway sees far fewer people return to prison after release, boasting one of the world's absolute lowest rates of recidivism.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative question to chew on. Do we get better together? Everything we've looked at today, from the shrinking prefrontal cortex all the way to global recidivism rates, points to a pretty fundamental truth. We rely on each other for our social reality, our emotional stability, and ultimately our rehabilitation. It really forces us to ask deep questions about our essential human need for connection and what that ultimately means for how we structure our justice systems moving forward. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this complex data today, and I hope this provided a clear window into the true anatomy of isolation.